The night my daughter-in-law stood in my living room and said, "This place could really use a fresh start," I had no idea she was talking about getting rid of me. My name is Margaret, and I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years teaching 5th grade at Riverside Elementary in Dayton, Ohio. I know how to handle difficult people. I know how to stay calm when someone is pushing every button you have. I thought those years in the classroom had prepared me for anything. I was wrong. Let me take you back to where this all began, because you need to understand what kind of woman I was before any of this happened. I was not a pushover. I was not the kind of mother who let her children walk all over her. I raised my son, Daniel, to say please and thank you, to look people in the eye, and to understand that respect is not optional in this family. His father, my husband Robert, backed me up every single time. We were a team. We had rules, and those rules kept our household peaceful and loving for 34 years. Robert passed away from a heart attack in the spring of 2021. It was sudden. It was devastating. One morning he was drinking his coffee at the kitchen table and reading the newspaper the way he had every single morning of our marriage, and by that afternoon he was gone. I won't pretend the years after that were easy. They were the hardest years of my life. The house felt enormous and silent in a way I had never experienced before, and there were nights when I would sit in Robert's chair just to feel close to him. But I kept going. I kept the house clean and the garden alive. I started a book club with my neighbor Carol. I visited my sister in Phoenix twice a year. I was managing. I was not thriving yet, but I was managing, and I was proud of that. Daniel called me every Sunday without fail. He lived about 40 minutes away in a rental apartment with his wife, Sandra. They had been married for 3 years by then. I will be honest with you. Sandra and I had never been particularly close. She was polite enough at holidays, but there was always something a little cool about her, a little transactional, like she was keeping score of something I didn't know we were playing. I told myself it was just her personality. Some people take longer to warm up. I gave her the benefit of the doubt because she made my son happy, and that mattered to me more than anything. So when Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening in September and asked if they could stay with me for a few months, I said yes without hesitating. He explained that their landlord had sold the building and they had 60 days to find a new place. The rental market in their area had become impossible, he said. They needed time to save up enough for a down payment on their own home. Just a few months. 6 months at the most. Of course, I told him. This house has 3 bedrooms. There's plenty of room. Daniel thanked me so many times that night I had to tell him to stop. This was what family did, I said. This was not a favor. This was just what family did. They moved in on a Saturday with 2 carloads of furniture and boxes. I had cleared out the guest bedroom and put fresh flowers on the dresser. I made a pot of chili and cornbread for their first night. Sandra walked through the front door, looked around the living room and said, "It's cozy." I told myself that was a compliment. The first few weeks were genuinely fine. Daniel helped me fix the gutters and replace the light fixture in the hallway that had been flickering for months. Sandra kept mostly to herself in the evenings, watching shows on her tablet with headphones in. We weren't close, but we were civil. We were managing. The first thing that bothered me was small, and I almost didn't say anything because I didn't want to seem petty. Sandra had rearranged the kitchen. I came downstairs one morning and found that all my cabinet organization had been completely changed. The mugs were in a different cabinet. The spices were in a drawer instead of on the rack Robert had built for me years ago. The rack itself was sitting on the counter like it was waiting to be thrown away. I took a breath and I said calmly and kindly, "Sandra, I appreciate that you like things a certain way, but this is my kitchen and I'd like to keep it the way I have it." She looked at me with this small smile and said, "It's just more efficient this way, Margaret. You'll get used to it." She turned back to her coffee. I stood there for a moment. Then I put the spice rack back on the wall, moved the mugs back to their cabinet, and reorganized everything the way it had been. I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the next few weeks, small things kept shifting. A throw pillow disappeared from the sofa. A painting Robert and I had bought on our trip to New Mexico was taken down from the hallway. I found it leaning against the wall in the garage. Sandra had put up a large framed print of a black and white cityscape in its place. When I asked her about it, she said that old thing was making the hallway look dated. That old thing was my husband's. We had picked it out together on our 20th anniversary trip. I brought it back inside and rehung it that same afternoon. Sandra made a noise that was not quite a sigh and not quite a comment, but sat somewhere in between. I talked to Daniel about it that evening. He listened to everything I said, and then he rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he was uncomfortable, and he said, "Mom, she's just trying to help. She's not trying to upset you." "I know she's not trying to upset me," I said. "But this is my home, Daniel. I need her to understand that." He nodded and said he would talk to her, and maybe he did, but nothing changed. 6 weeks in, Sandra mentioned at dinner that her sister and brother-in-law were going through a rough patch and needed a place to stay temporarily. "Just 2 or 3 weeks," she said, not looking at me, cutting her food. "They could take the other room." I put my fork down. "Sandra, there is no other room. The 3rd bedroom is my sewing room. You could move the sewing machine into the garage." I looked at my son. He was looking at his plate. "No," I said. "I'm sorry, but no. This is already a full house. I can't take in more people." Sandra smiled the way someone smiles when they've decided not to argue, but also haven't changed their mind. "Of course," she said. "I understand." Her sister never came to stay, but something shifted after that conversation. Sandra became quieter toward me, more distant, and there was a coolness in the house that hadn't been there before. I could feel it every time I walked into a room she was in. I kept going about my life. I went to book club. I tended my garden. I called my sister in Phoenix and told her things were a little tense but manageable. "Just give it time," my sister said. "Once they get their own place, it'll go back to normal." 4 months turned into 5. 5 turned into 6. When I gently asked Daniel about their timeline, he told me the down payment was taking longer to save than expected. "Just a couple more months, Mom. I promise." I said okay. Because he was my son. Because I loved him. Because I kept telling myself that this was temporary. Around month 7, I noticed Sandra had started having her friends over during the day while I was out. I would come home from the grocery store or from Carol's house and find 3 or 4 women I didn't know sitting in my living room, wine glasses on my coffee table, music playing from a portable speaker Sandra had put on the mantel where Robert's photograph used to sit. I moved the photograph back every time. Every time, within a day or 2, it would be gone again. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected and found Sandra giving 2 of her friends what could only be described as a tour. She was walking them through the house, gesturing at the rooms, talking about what she would change, what she would update, what needed to go. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and listened to her tell her friend that the appliances were outdated and the whole room needed to be gutted and modernized. When she saw me standing there, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled and said, "Margaret, you're back early." That night I told Daniel exactly what had happened. I told him clearly and without raising my voice that his wife had been giving tours of my home like it belonged to her and that it needed to stop. Daniel got defensive in a way I had not seen before. His voice got tight and he said, "She's just enthusiastic about design, Mom. She wasn't trying to be disrespectful." "Daniel, she was talking about gutting my kitchen. She was just talking. In my house." He looked away. "I'll talk to her." He didn't. Or if he did, it made no difference. Month 8 was when things became something I can only describe as a slow unraveling. Sandra stopped acknowledging me in the morning. If I was in the kitchen, she would pour her coffee and leave without a word. If I tried to start a conversation, she gave one-word answers. The evenings felt like sharing a space with strangers, except worse, because they were strangers who had moved into my home. I found out about the finances by accident. I had been looking for a folder of insurance documents in my filing cabinet in the spare room. I had kept the cabinet there when Sandra's things took over the sewing room and pushed mine aside. The folder I needed wasn't where I expected it. While I was looking, I found a document I didn't recognize. It had my name on it, and Daniel's name, but it was something I had never signed. I read it twice. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs felt unsteady. It was a letter to my homeowner's insurance company, written as if from me, stating that Daniel and Sandra were co-residents with shared property rights in the event of my incapacitation or death. It was not signed by me. The signature at the bottom looked like an attempt to copy mine. My hands were shaking. I am not a dramatic person. I do not panic easily. But I sat in that room for a long time with that document in my hands, and I understood that this had stopped being about a spice rack a long time ago. I did not confront Sandra or Daniel that night. I took the document and I made a copy at the library the next morning. Then I drove to the office of a family law attorney named Patricia Howe, whom Carol had recommended months ago when I first started feeling uneasy. I had told myself I didn't need a lawyer. I had told myself this was a family matter and family matters didn't need lawyers. I sat in Patricia's office and I put that document on her desk. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me and said, "Margaret, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You need to document everything from this point forward. Do not tell them you've been here. Do not change your behavior. And do not let them know what you found." I went home that afternoon and I was calm. I was so calm, it surprised me. I think it was because I finally knew what I was dealing with, and knowing is always better than wondering. Over the next 2 weeks, I did exactly what Patricia told me to do. I kept notes with dates and times. I took photographs with my phone. The missing photographs, the rearranged rooms, the signs that Sandra's world was steadily replacing mine inside my own home. I kept everything in a folder I stored at Carol's house. I also, quietly and without telling anyone, spoke to a real estate attorney about my options as a homeowner. I learned things that surprised me. I learned that even without a lease, a formal notice to vacate was required, and that I had more power than I had been made to feel. That knowledge sat in my chest like something solid. Then came the night. Everything broke open. I had been in my bedroom reading when I heard raised voices downstairs. At first I thought Sandra and Daniel were arguing with each other, which was not unheard of. But when I listened more carefully, I realized Daniel was on the phone and the voice was angry and directed at me, specifically by name. I opened my door and walked to the top of the stairs. He was in the kitchen, pacing, phone pressed to his ear. I could not hear the other side of the call, but I heard my son say, "She's never going to leave on her own. You know that. We have to make it impossible for her to stay." I stood at the top of those stairs for what felt like a very long time. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed Robert and I had shared for 30 years in that house, and I thought about what kind of person my son had become, and whether I had missed the signs, and whether any of this was something I could have prevented. And then I stopped asking those questions, because they were not useful questions. The useful question was what I was going to do next. I called Patricia that night. I told her what I had heard. She told me she was ready to move, and that I needed to be ready too. 2 days later, I told Daniel and Sandra over dinner that I had been thinking about things, and that I had realized they needed more space than I could give them, and that maybe it was time for me to go stay with my sister in Phoenix for a little while. Sandra looked up from her plate. Something moved across her face, something quick, something she covered almost immediately with a carefully neutral expression. But I saw it. I had spent 31 years reading the faces of 10-year-olds trying to hide things from me. "That might be a good idea," she said. Daniel said nothing. He looked at his food. "I told them I would be leaving on Friday. I told them I would leave a key so they could keep an eye on the house while I was gone. I even mentioned, casually, that I wasn't sure how long I would stay in Phoenix. Maybe through the holidays. I spent Thursday packing a bag. I made sure they could see me doing it. Friday morning, I hugged Daniel, who hugged me back stiffly, and I told Sandra to take care of things, and I drove away. I drove to Carol's house 4 blocks away, and I parked in her garage. Carol handed me a cup of tea. We sat at her kitchen table, and we waited. Patricia had filed the formal notice to vacate that Thursday. It had been served that same afternoon, while I was at the grocery store picking up a few things for appearance's sake. The notice gave them 30 days. But what I was waiting for that Friday was something else. Carol's daughter, who lived 2 houses down from mine on the other side of the street, had agreed to text me if anything notable happened at the house. At 2:17 that afternoon, my phone lit up. The text said, "They have people over. Music. Looks like a party." A few minutes later, another text. Someone put balloons on the porch. And then, Sandra's outside saying something. People are laughing. Carol looked at me over her tea. I looked at her. Then I picked up my keys. I drove the 4 blocks back to my house. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment, watching. There were 8 or 9 people in my front yard. Sandra was standing near the porch with a glass in her hand, wearing a dress I had never seen before, laughing loudly. Someone had put a little banner near the front door that said, "Fresh Start." There were 2 women I recognized as her regular visitors and several people I had never seen before. Music was coming from inside, from speakers loud enough to reach the yard. I watched Sandra gesture broadly at the house, the way someone gestures when they're showing off something that belongs to them. I got out of the car. I walked up the front path at a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. 2 of the guests near the garden noticed me first. Their expressions changed. One of them touched the arm of the woman next to her. Sandra was mid-sentence when she turned and saw me. The glass in her hand stopped halfway to her mouth. "Margaret," she said, "I thought you were on your way to Phoenix." "I decided to come back," I said. "I forgot something." There was a silence that extended itself in a way I found almost satisfying. I looked at the banner by my front door. I looked at the balloons. I looked at the strangers standing in my yard holding drinks. "I think it's time for everyone to head home," I said, pleasantly. "I appreciate you all stopping by." People started looking at Sandra. Sandra was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression I had seen on students who had been caught at something and were calculating whether there was any way out. There wasn't. Patricia arrived 20 minutes later. I had called her from the front step while Sandra's guests were filtering out. She came with the documentation, the notice to vacate that had already been legally served, a copy of the fraudulent insurance document, and a letter from a forensic document examiner who had already reviewed the forged signature. Daniel had come downstairs by then. He stood in the living room doorway, looking at his mother and his wife and a family law attorney, and I watched something happen on his face that was hard to see. It was not quite remorse. It was more like the moment someone realizes there is no version of this story where they are not the person who did what they did. I did not yell. I did not cry. I sat in my armchair, Robert's armchair, and I let Patricia do the talking. Sandra tried, at first, to explain the insurance document. She said it had been a misunderstanding. She said she had only been trying to help manage things in case something happened to me. She said she hadn't thought it needed my signature because it wasn't meant to be official. Patricia put on her reading glasses and let Sandra finish. Then she explained, in a tone that was completely devoid of drama, exactly which laws had been broken and what the consequences could include. Sandra stopped talking. I looked at my son. He was looking at the carpet. "Daniel," I said. He looked up. "I love you," I said. He looked up. I love you, but you allowed this to happen in my home. You need to understand what that means. He didn't say anything. His jaw moved, but no words came out. They left that evening. Sandra packed 2 large suitcases and took them to her sister's apartment, the same sister she had wanted to move into my home months ago. Daniel took a bag and said he would get the rest later. He stood at the front door for a moment before he left, and I think he wanted to say something, but he didn't, and I didn't push him. I stood in my own living room after they were gone, and I just breathed. I put Robert's photograph back on the mantel. I hung our New Mexico painting back in its place in the hallway. I put the spice rack back on the wall and reorganized my kitchen cabinets exactly the way they had always been. And when I opened the cabinet and saw the mugs lined up in the right order in the right place, I sat down at my kitchen table and I let myself cry for a few minutes. Not from sadness exactly, from relief, from the feeling of being back inside my own life. Carol came over that evening with a bottle of wine and a rotisserie chicken, and we sat at my kitchen table and ate and talked for 3 hours. She told me she had been worried about me for months and hadn't known how to say it. I told her she could have said it any time. She laughed and said, "You know how stubborn you are, Margaret." I told her she was right. The formal legal process took another 2 months to fully resolve. Sandra's attempt to forge my signature was documented and reported. A formal complaint was filed. I was advised that civil proceedings were an option, and I chose to pursue them for the value of the property she had sold. Yes, I discovered later that 3 items had been removed from the house, including a small antique clock that had belonged to Robert's mother, which Sandra had sold to a consignment shop. We located it. I got it back. Daniel called me 6 weeks after everything happened. It was a Sunday, the usual time he used to call, which I thought meant something. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how to explain what had happened to him over those months, how he had gotten so turned around. He said Sandra had a way of making him see things that weren't there and not see things that were, and he knew that wasn't an excuse. I told him I heard him. I told him I wasn't ready to act as though none of it had happened, but that I was his mother, and that door was not permanently closed. That was all I could honestly give him at that point, and he said he understood. I have been in my home now for 7 months since that evening on the front path. My garden came back beautifully this spring. The book club finished a mystery series we all loved, and we're starting something new next month. I had the kitchen repainted the same yellow it has always been, the yellow I chose with Robert the year we bought the house, because I had noticed Sandra had ordered paint swatches in gray and left them on the counter, as if the decision had already been made. It had not. I want to say one thing to anyone listening to this who recognizes something in this story. I waited too long. I saw the signs early, the little reorganizations, the casual disrespect, the slow erosion of the understanding that this was my home, and I told myself it was manageable, it was temporary, it was not worth the conflict. I should have set the terms clearly on day 1, not harshly, not unkindly, but clearly. This is my home. These are my belongings. These are the conditions of your stay. I should have said those things out loud in the first week, and I should have meant them, and I should have enforced them the first time they were tested. Because once you let someone believe they can take an inch, some people will take everything. I know my own strength now. I know the sound of my own footsteps in this house. I know where my photographs belong and what my kitchen looks like when it's right. And I know, in a way I perhaps hadn't fully known before all of this, that I am the one who gets to decide what happens here. Robert built this life with me. I am not going anywhere.